So I've been playing the third birthday. You know, having played these games, I feel weird calling the Parasite Eve series a, series. I mean, all three of these games really only have two things in common. Aya, and the overarching theme of something mitochondria. Still, the story does actually take place 10 years after the events of Parasite Eve 2, and it stars the previously mentioned Aya Brea and her convoluted past. Now, the story itself is barely explained during the cutscenes, and instead is explained through optional documents and files. The basic gist of things I could gather from these is that this dude called Hydebore found Aya in a wedding dress covered in blood without her memories, and that these things called Twisted just kinda appeared out of nowhere and started attacking shit for no reason. So Hyde and a bunch of other people, including Aya, started a secret FBI time travel group called the CTI in order to fight the Twisted. And yeah, the story is kinda all over the place. But it is perfectly playable as a standalone game despite the overarching plot. I say that because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense anyway. It's the kind of story that'll start making sense once you start reading up on shit afterwards. But even then, it's still pretty hard to understand. I mean, I checked the files whenever I wasn't sure which plot twists actually were plot twists. And since most events take place off-screen during missions or in between, those moments were almost constant. Really, it kind of feels like a fanfiction written by 14-year-olds more than anything. Talented 14-year-olds, mind you, but still 14-year-olds. Now, like I said before, the CTI used time travel. And you can't have time travel without timeline distortions. So, basically anything goes. It's far from great, but at least it was kind of enjoyable, I think. Maybe. Kinda. Anyway, the game is a third-person shooter. So, where the first two games were inspired by Resident Evil 1 and 2, the third birthday seems to be inspired by Resi 4. Although, Square describes it as a cinematic action RPG. So now I have to take back what I said about these games only having two things in common. They have, in fact, three things in common. Being that all of these games seem to have some kind of perverse fetish for cinematics. Despite Square's made-up genre names though, it's just another generic third-person shooter on the PSP. And we all know that the PSP is perfect for shooters. You know, with that single little nipple that thinks it's an analog stick. Still, the controls aren't actually all that bad, especially when compared to such wonders as Brothers in Arms D-Day, which is indeed an FPS for the PSP and it's exactly as terrible as it sounds. Now, as is tradition for action games on the PSP, most of the gameplay's faults seem to be because of the PSP rather than the game itself. So, things like the cover system being a bit awkward because Aya automatically clings to every waist-high surface even when you don't want her to, or having to move the camera with the D-pad while still having to walk with the thumbstick are pretty much shit. But I can't really blame the game for that, since there's only one analog stick and two shoulder buttons. Despite that though, the gameplay is actually kind of fun, even though it's generic as fuck. Thing is, it does that thing where you run through linear corridor-like levels with a few bigger rooms that have locked doors in them that won't open until you clear a certain objective, which is usually just killing off all enemies. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is bad or anything, but it does get a little bit repetitive when you play for longer sessions. Still, given that Square royally fucked up action games on capable consoles, I was pleasantly surprised to find that things like shooting and locking on actually work. I mean, the game is pretty good at locking on to the right target, even though switching targets is still a bit awkward to do with the D-pad while walking, and dodging attacks by rolling and strafing out of the way while emptying clips on your enemies actually felt rewarding somehow. Thing is, dodging is easy to do because enemy projectiles hover towards you slowly. So it's kinda like playing a slightly more awkward and slow as fuck Doom. Now, in order to make the gameplay slightly less generic, they gave Aya a new ability called Overdive, which lets her body swap with friendly NPCs during battle. And while I have to admit that it felt a bit awkward at first, it's actually used rather intuitively for what it is. For instance, you're in a battle and there's two types of enemies, ground-based enemies and aerial enemies. Now, what you need to do is use Overdive to switch between friendlies so you always have the advantage. Think of things like switching to a sniper to take out the flying guys and then quickly popping back down again to clean up the remaining grunts. It isn't incredibly deep, but at least it's better than just mindlessly shooting shit, even though that's still kinda what you do. They even made sure you stayed locked on target so you don't feel completely disorientated whenever you overdive. And when you rack up consecutive hits, you can take down an enemy with an overdive kill. The AI also plays into this, as their shots also contribute to the building up of the overdrive killage. Now, a mechanic like this could have easily been a living hell if the AI was shit, but it's not. I mean, they actually shoot at stuff and duck for cover when they need to, and they're even stood at places where it would make sense from a tactical standpoint. And sure, sometimes they'll go and get themselves killed, but I'd be lying if I said that that never happened to me. Now, of course, it wouldn't be a Square Enix game if there weren't any RPG mechanics. As per usual, you gain EXP and level up. Apart from that, you're able to upgrade your weapons, buy new ones, and gain new abilities via a DNA materia chipset system thing. Now, you buy and upgrade weapons at terminals you find in between objectives, both of which require BP, which you earn by killing enemies. Overall, it doesn't really add much, and to be brutally honest, I didn't really notice a whole lot of differences between weapons. That said though, I barely skimmed the surface in terms of unlockables, so there were plenty of guns I wasn't able to use, which could be seen as an incentive to play the game a second time, but I just wasn't really interested. However, something I was interested in was the ability to upgrade your shit via the before mentioned DNA materia chipset thingy called Overenergy. Overenergy allows you to mess around with Aya's DNA to generate new abilities. You do that by installing these materia-looking things called Overenergy chips into a grid. These energy chips contain perks like faster regeneration, an increase in strength, or new overdive attacks. Now, these chips come in sets, so you can't just put them down willy-nilly because you might end up overriding abilities and sometimes even end up fusing them together. And I mean, it isn't incredibly deep or anything like that, but I did have a lot of fun dicking around with it in between missions. Now, if there's one mechanic in this game that you may already be aware of, it's probably Aya's clothing and how it relates to her health. Thing is, while your HP is represented with an on-screen health bar, damage is also shown by Aya's clothing deteriorating. So the closer to death you are, the more revealing Aya's clothing becomes. And, well, I don't know. It all just seems a bit weird to me. I mean, maybe if you're looking to cream yourself over some extremely jaggy PSP tier polygons, it might motivate you to play the game on the edge to make things more difficult for yourself, thus enhancing the experience and shit. But I feel like that's giving it too much credit. All it really is just fan service. Harmless, but quite frankly out of place fan service. And I'm by no means an SJW or any kind of precious little flower, and it's not like I'm offended by it either or anything like that. In fact, I'm fine with shit like this being in erotically themed games or whatever the fuck Mahjong Pretty Good Battery is supposed to be. And even in fighting games or things like Hyperdimension Neptunia, I usually don't mind fan service at all. But in a series that seems to take itself seriously, it just seems really out of place to me. And not only that, it's also just implemented very poorly. thing is, the game isn't serious about its sexual themes, nor does it approach it in a lighthearted manner. In fact, it doesn't even directly reference it at all. Aya just goes and then spends some time under the shower only to violate the door. And yeah, I made fun of the previous game's marketing campaign for similar reasons, and also just because I like making fun of Square, but that shit never really made its way into the games. If anything, Aya seemed to be a fairly strong and an at least somewhat realistic portrayal of a young female cop. I mean, she was kinda lacking in personality sometimes, but at least they didn't turn her into some otaku's crusty body pillow. They even went so far as to completely change her personality. The same Aya that shoved aside her date in the first game and fought this thing without even complaining about it in the second game is kind of a crybaby now. And I mean, I doubt I'd be any more heroic in a similar situation, but I'm not the fucking protagonist now, am I? And yeah, in a way, being scared of all this shit seems somewhat realistic, and it even kinda reminds me a bit of Heather from Silent Hill 3. But Silent Hill 3 had a sense of groundedness to it, and Heather's character was also very down to earth. Aya isn't down to earth at all. If anything, it just comes across as melodramatic. Hell, it even creates some lordy nerd of Durkadar, since she's a bloody killing machine whenever you're in control, but during the cutscenes she can barely even pull the fucking trigger. Again, it all just feels like it's implemented very poorly. I mean, I could see why a developer would want to have a protagonist that could grow and that the player could relate to. And an easy way to do that would be to create someone weak. And Aya does become a bit more assertive as she slowly regains some of her memories, so it kinda seems like that's what they were going for, but it just didn't work out at all, really. Well, not for me anyway. Now, despite the cinematographer likely being hired while taking upskirts on a Japanese train, the cutscenes do look very good. Once again, it shows how Square really loves making cutscenes, and luckily they're quite good at it. And yeah, of course the writing is a bit spotty and the voice acting can seem a bit awkward because of it, but they did create a story that I really enjoyed watching, despite the fact that it didn't make any sense at all. And I'm sure it's all very gay and retarded and what have you. But as I've said many times before, I actually like Square's bullshitty way of storytelling. And you know what I also like? The game's soundtrack. Disappointing segue. Apart from the generic, bombastic, and not so fantastic action movie music, there's actually some pretty cool atmospheric music in there. I mean, it does kind of feel like the game still thinks that it's a horror game, even though it clearly isn't. But in a way, that's actually what made it seem so very cool to me. Like, everything in the game feels a bit unsettling because of it. I mean, that particular track I just showed you plays at the CTI base. A place that should feel safe. A place that should feel homely. But it doesn't. Instead, it feels eerie as fuck. Add that to the fact that they keep Aya locked away in a prison cell, and the fact that everyone sounds very uncanny valley.
You can go running back to your den with your friends.
What are you talking about?
Your den. The Babel.
And you end up with something that actually feels surprisingly bizarre for an action game. Hell, I'm not even sure if any of this was intentional or not, but I like it either way. Overall though, I'd say it's a pretty good game, but it's also a Square Enix game, so everything is vague and mysterious for the sake of being vague and mysterious, and all characters look like they just came rolling out of an H&M store in one of those cartoony fight clouds.